I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our speaker that you probably all know, Mr. Tom White, who has done a great deal of work in area that we all should know a lot more, Holocaust and genocide. He is a professor at Keene University, Keene College, and very involved in this education. As you know, we have had other speakers speaking about genocide, Holocaust. Our last speaker, who happened to be here, Judge Whalen, who spoke on that subject. After this discussion, we will have hopefully other speakers who speak on world peace and how other institutions and other groups are working to improve the world peace, and we will have other speakers to do that one. So with this introduction, let us welcome Mr. Tom White.
Isa, thank you, and thank you to the Windham World Affairs Council for this kind invitation. Is my voice carrying okay for the room? Okay. A couple of things. This presentation is based on a singular trip in November, 2 Novembers ago, to Auschwitz as part of a United Nations group of diplomats, African, South American, some European, who are going to Auschwitz under the rubric of an organization called the Auschwitz Institute on Peace and Reconciliation, the Raphael Lemkin Seminar. And their goal was to use Auschwitz as a place to wrestle with how to identify and respond effectively to genocide currently in the world. So our classroom was Auschwitz. Our classroom actually was literally inside of Auschwitz 1 in Block 12. And so the power of place began to permeate everything we were wrestling with there. I was there as an observer, which allowed me a little more time to kind of escape the group and go out on my own every now and again. The presentation you see comes together only because I couldn't let it go. I took photographs, I probably estimate in the thousands, only really for a couple of reasons, realizing most of my work is with high school students, middle school students, who never would go to Auschwitz, would never have a chance from New Hampshire or Vermont to go there. So my initial thought was that I was going to go and document it so they could at least have a sense of what this place was like. In the midst of doing that, one of my issues that I'll share with you, much of this presentation is about how I even came to make the presentation, how it actually comes together. It was much more difficult than I imagined. I didn't even want to use the photographs as I took them. There came a part where I almost mind-numbingly was taking them out of obligation, but didn't even want to look as to what I was trying to capture, and asking the whole time, why am I photographing the world's largest graveyard? And so I'm going to share with you some of my wrestling that I go through in making this presentation and how it made no sense. I make presentations all the time. This one just could not come together until something clicked in my mind, and I'll share with you what that was and how this comes to pass. The end goal of a presentation like this, I think, the power of place, now 71 years after liberation, right? January 27th is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day when Auschwitz was liberated. Becomes sort of a touchstone moment, doesn't it, where we sort of look back and say, have we learned from this particular place? So what I'd like to do is kind of frame my presentation a few ways. First, to give some kind of scope and scale to the singular place, we have this here, right? More than all British and U.S. deaths in the Second World War in this one camp. And as I began to create this presentation, literally on the flight home and the nights after this, I had all these photographs, and I decided that I had to only craft this presentation based on that one experience. So all the photographs you will see are taken from that one time. There are occasions where I'll bring in other photographs and I'll explain to you why I did that, but my own self-imposed framework was to only use the imagery I took on this particular trip. And when you're in a place like Auschwitz, you realize this is a man-made place, and that the perpetrators of evil in our world are human beings who choose to become perpetrators, who by and large believe that what they're doing is morally justifiable. They go to sleep very well every night, knowing they've done very difficult but very important work. I like to use the place to kind of peek into the universe of the perpetrator. What did he see as he constructed Auschwitz, and she as well? We'll explore the moral universe of the perpetrators to see what to them was morally acceptable and how the place reinforced that belief structure. So the architecture will very much feed not only their objective and their worldview, but also, of course, deeply impact their targets who arrive as well. I was so focused looking inward, there was a moment where I realized I hadn't looked outward. What would I see next time? I looked outside the camp to see the houses where the guards stayed, that their families lived in. There was one moment, I'll bring that in, the Commandant of Auschwitz house at Auschwitz I. I'll share with you that moment. But I wonder what else I would see if I looked at a greater arc outside the camps. As I do this, of course, we are going to try to, illustrate the perpetrator mindset, but never excuse it. Right? We can't justify it away, but we can try to understand its perspective. And so we have to condemn what we're going to see and take responsibility for that. One of the most difficult things I encountered unexpectedly was contentiousness of space. When you're in Poland, you're talking about conflicting historical memories. The Poles were the first mass victims of the Nazis, decimated in 1939 by German policy to clear land for settlement. They have their own national history of trauma throughout the war. The Jewish trauma also is a separate but also interlocked history that, as you will see, competes for memory. So I'll look at the contentiousness of space and place, and in my view, how I, raised as a Catholic, try to deal with what I was facing. A presentation like this could lead us to lose hope, to give up, and to say there's so much evil in the world, what are we going to do? If we come to that position, we might as well just give up. I really am an optimist. I really think all of us here tonight engaging in this topic is because all of us can and will make this a better place. I see generations of people here who will witness this kind of history with the real meaning of making the world a better place for all of us. So in the end, I want to condemn what we're going to see, but go further and embrace hope. Embrace the work that we do together to make the world a better place. There is one thing worse than Auschwitz itself, said a survivor, and that is if the world forgets there ever was such a place. And with that, I'd like to start with a survivor's voice, and then I'll end the presentation with a survivor's voice as well. Let me talk about contentious space and memory first. So as I began to put this together, we had begun our tour in Krakow, and we were here at Kazimierz, which was the the Jewish section of Krakow, totally intact today. One of the few places you'll find in Eastern Europe where that's true. And the reason why is that Wawel Castle, the headquarters of the general government of the Nazis, is just around the corner. And so when the government officials came in and their families were looking for housing, they decided to simply claim these Jewish properties for their own families and for the government, which is why they remain intact. The Jews were then shipped and forced down across the river about a mile or so away to the Krakow ghetto, and then from there shipped to Auschwitz as well. But here we were sitting here hearing that history and talking about the old Jewish presence there that is now slightly coming back. And this is where it began for me as a witness looking at this. And again, the photographs I'm using are my own, so it's my perspective there. But again, I wondered, what kind of memory does this place evoke in me? And so I decided to look at imagery from that time to try to imagine in my mind, right, what it was that I was looking at. When I did that, this is the roundup as we're heading to the Krakow ghetto. You know, all that's gone. The echoes, those memories, those voices, those experiences, right, are totally absent. So how does one share an absence? Right? How does one deal with this kind of memory other than in a static way like this? So I think it's helpful to kind of reclaim space by really superimposing those images from those times. Why I also find that helpful is as you engage these kind of horrific topics, there is kind of this mistake, I think, to claim it as your own experience. In other words, what I mean, often teachers have students write in their journals, how do you feel in studying this? The kids get very evocative and almost traumatize themselves. And it isn't their trauma. And so I'm wrestling with that as I put this presentation together, trying to claim that time and space for them and not necessarily just for me. So I'll do the reverse now. So you can see how my mind is working. I'm playing with what works better, starting where I am and looking back, or the other way around. So this is now inside the Krakow ghetto, and these are now arriving from Kazimierz, these Jews. And what you tend to see are children carrying chairs. They were told to bring chairs so they could set up schoolhouses and that kind of thing. And families moving in. This part of the ghetto here were for the elderly, infirm, or the first to be deported to Auschwitz. The rest was going to be a working camp. So, maybe a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away from the ghetto is the Schindler factory. How many have seen the movie Schindler's List? Okay. So,
Schindler.
I was very familiar, of course, with the Schindler story. I had visited his grave in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and was very curious to see the factory and the museum there. Didn't realize how close it was to the Krakow ghetto, and didn't realize, of course, that these were your slave laborers heading to the factory, except when I arrived there. The very first thing that I spotted on the outside of this Jewish experience during the occupation was this sign, almost usurping the space for the Catholic Church, saying, "Don't forget our suffering." For me, I was deeply offended as someone raised Catholic, claiming someone else's space. This is Jewish space. The perpetrator here was a Catholic, Oskar Schindler. And so I was very, very offended, and I began to wrestle with, how do we deal with contentious space and still honor the difference and recognize both groups suffering and not claim one over the other? So I really believe we are caretakers of space, which is what Auschwitz is, right? This space that we're looking at. And so maybe if I then come to the present, we can talk about that symbolism of the memorial here in the Krakow ghetto, which are those chairs of the children. The idea is that it invites you to join in this empty space, sit on the chairs. Take quiet time to be contemplative of that space. It's an interesting concept to try to make this bridge between the past and then. And that got me to thinking about how do we do that? And how effective are these memorials and these symbols to connect us with that previous past? Now before I get to Auschwitz, Auschwitz itself is a symbol of the Holocaust. But a larger context is this. In 2013, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington had completed a project they've been engaged in for many years to try to document how many camps there were in the Nazi Empire. The initial estimate was 2,000 to 3,000. We have now documented 42,500 camps, ghettos, work camps, concentration camps, slave labor camps involved in the Nazi Empire, including North Africa. Auschwitz is one of 42,500 camps. I'm not going to get into the history of what kind of camps they were and all that, but we'll now go to what were known as the extermination or death camps or annihilation camps. And as you'll see, they evolve in different ways here. The history of the Operation Reinhard camps, let me just illustrate a couple of things. Their length of operation and the numbers killed. Treblinka is a football field and a half in its size. So these are particular camps that have gas chamber crematoria operating as killing centers. Helmno, the first camp, will be closed by April of 1943, by and large, for a number of reasons, but by and large because most of their targeted Jews in that area had been annihilated. You'll see here, Majdanek for a very short period of time operates as a death camp, and you can see the numbers here. Auschwitz is outside of this system. It's added to this particular system. And it becomes the largest killing center. And as you'll see, it ends up being 3 large camps with a number of satellite camps around it, and becomes sort of now our symbol of this. So we began in Auschwitz I, the first of the 3 camps. It was a Polish cavalry camp that the Nazis immediately see its usefulness as a concentration camp for Poles. So initially starts as for Polish political prisoners. As I'm looking at, again, an image that I took, as I'm weeding through how to use these, the Auerbach Frei gate, work will set you free. You're standing outside, how does one come to this space? I was actually a bit scared, to be quite honest. I couldn't sleep the night before, wondering what I was going to encounter here, having studied it for so long. And the biggest dilemma that I had is, should I even photograph? There are so many photographs of this place. What would mine add to it? And the conclusion I came to myself was, it was for my children and my personal experience I could share with them, and maybe the students that I work with. But it didn't get any easier as you photographed this place. And as I wrestled with that, something happened to me that was also unexpected. I've been to many museums, many Holocaust sites, Babi Yar, the museum in Washington, Yad Vashem, etc. And at every museum I go to, there are people who get very, very upset when children who are in those exhibits are laughing or goofing around, And I've never been affronted by that. Because for me, if children are children and are experiencing life and are happy, isn't that the opposite of what these perpetrators hoped for? So I'm never affronted by that. I don't mind life in all its wonderful expressions. Here it bothered me. Was it because I went from a symbolic representation in a museum to something real? I'm not sure, but I want to share with you sort of a quintessential moment all of us who go there have talked about. Before I get to that particular moment, I want to share with you how it goes from a symbolic thing you study to something very real to something very personal. These are 2 dear friends of mine. One is an FBI agent and one is a rabbi. So my group, again, was a collection of people from all over the world. And one of the most beautiful things that happened was in Auschwitz, which is the Polish city that the camp is located in. A synagogue was rediscovered, been hidden in 1939, all the valuables buried underneath and rediscovered by an Israeli scholar. And a friend of ours has now spent money in refurbishing it. So after our time in Auschwitz I, we went one night to the synagogue. Little synagogue, wonderful sanctuary with the Torah and the Ark there. And I said, Rabbi, please say a prayer. And he took out the Torah scroll and he sang a beautiful prayer. The echo of a Jewish prayer in Auschwitz was such a powerful assertion of life. It was a beautiful moment for me that the Nazis hadn't won. What made it even more spectacular for me, dealing with all the Islamophobia that we're facing in our country, this ridiculous hatred we're facing, is one of my dearest friends who was there, is this Muslim woman from Turkey, who was so moved by hearing part of her faith tradition as well, these Jewish prayers coming from the synagogue.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful moment for me that I'll never forget. So here she is looking at the Torah scroll. One of the things I find helpful before we get into the camp is to, and I cannot find, someone out there may have this, the survivor who said this, right? That one can visit Auschwitz, but one can never be in Auschwitz. I would add the addendum with great humility, thank God. And so as you visit this place and you realize you're only a visitor, I think that's a terrific, humbling first step. Which is why the next thing threw me. And it shouldn't have. I'd heard this done before and all. But when it happens, it throws you. So at this point, I'm wandering the grounds. You can see it's sort of a foggy November morning. They're meeting in session in Block 12, and I've snuck out to try to photograph the camp when it's relatively quiet. And then it happened. The selfie at the Auerbach Frei gate. I was devastated. I was angry. I couldn't understand, as I'm wrestling with the camp, why these 2 young girls wanted to have their picture there smiling. One of the things I made as rule number 1 is, my picture will never be taken in Auschwitz. Because this is not my space. Right? If I come back and here's Tom in Auschwitz, what have I done? I've raised myself up, somehow this makes me more, no, this isn't my space, I never want to be seen there. And yet, they had no problem being seen there and laughing. I was angry. I was really angry. But as any good thinking person would do, you pause, calm yourself down, and you begin to think a little bit more. Now, I'm not very social media savvy. I still have a flip phone, to be quite honest, I really do. So I couldn't quite understand the social media aspect of this, but I've since thought about it because one of my friends said, Tom, what if they take this picture and after the end of their tour, they look at their phone, look at that picture again, and they say to themselves, why was I smiling at the Auschwitz gate? They've learned, right, through their, and I thought, you could be exactly right. And I began to realize that today's generation invests a lot in telling their own narrative. They want the world to see where they've been. What a great opportunity. Another witness now on social media, not the witness of smiling at the gate, but what have we gone through? So then I thought, maybe, just maybe, this could be a positive. As they document and share, they are doing just that, and that's a very important role to play in our modern world. I find that many of the students that I work with, not only do they like to be heard, but they want to make the world a better place. If you look at our country, even in the past 10 years, issues like homophobia, this generation says, what are you talking about? I think it's such a great positive step forward. So I think, in a way, though this is not me, but it's them, and I think they're there because they want to make a difference, and that's what I'm hopeful for. But how do we then go back and recognize place and space and honor that as different space than ours? Well, I think the first thing you want to do is to, again, recognize yourself as outside of it. And I think the first thing that I could do is I could show these girls, there are no images of Auschwitz I, many actually. There are a few, but not of the ones I'm looking for, but of the gate. But there are survivor memories and survivor testimony here in art. And so again, I superimpose that space over mine. And then I ask myself, do you think they would want their picture taken at that time, if that was going on? And the answer is, of course not. And if that's true, then how do we get beyond where they are now? I think when you go to a place like this, anywhere in the world where there's mass atrocity, the first thing that you have to recognize is that you're a mourner. You've come to a graveyard, a gravesite. And like any of us who go to a gravesite of someone we love, we go and we recognize that life, a well-lived life with wonderful memories, as that life, not mine. We put a rock on the grave, or in other traditions, maybe a flower, to recognize that we're visiting their story and we're honoring their presence in the world by visiting. And maybe that's a great first step for someone going to Auschwitz or to any mass atrocity site, to go as a mourner in respect for those who actually existed here. So Auschwitz I, a camp, you can see here again, a military camp. The eerie thing about it is it's relatively beautiful. There are beautiful trees that line the camp. The buildings are well constructed by this brick. And as I'm taking photographs of exactly what I want, sort of the mist coming in and all that, I become increasingly horrified that I'm taking something aesthetically useful for a presentation. I didn't know how to wrestle with that. So the more pictures I took, the more I felt like I was defeating the very purpose of being there, and yet I need to witness it with my photographs. Our classroom is block 12 here. So every morning we walked in through the guard tower, the barbed wire gate. A very difficult classroom, but as a visitor, a little bit easier. Auschwitz I begins in August 44, holds about 16,000 prisoners. And by now, by the end of the war, it's a mixture of Jews, Poles, and others, Auschwitz I. So one morning I'm walking around again and again, there's not many folks there, and I took this image, and again I find these as I go through my volumes of images. Which one will I use in this presentation and why? And this one really struck me. Not because of the singularity of the person, but because this is where the Auschwitz Orchestra used to play. And so I looked and looked and looked, and was there an image I could use? Then I found a picture taken by the perpetrators in Auschwitz to show the orchestra. I'm going to show you a limitation of using perpetrator imagery. Right? I've done it. I have gone back, I have reclaimed this space from our time to theirs, and I've now illustrated, right, Auschwitz I. If I took the context out and I just said to you, look at this photograph, and tell me about the horrors of Auschwitz and the Holocaust, what do you see? You see a band playing in a well-manicured area because that's what the perpetrator's mind sees. And that's what the perpetrator wants you to see. Partially because they don't want to be prosecuted for war crimes. But mentally for them, this is the world they're seeing. So to me, viewing anything through the lens of the perpetrator puts us in a very awkward position of being a voyeur. Sitting here, looking here at the camp through the photographer's eyes. So that in and of itself will not do what I want. So how do I then claim the space back if I can't use Nazi photography? Voices of survivors. Primo Levi gives you something different, I think, when he says, the tunes are few, a dozen, the same ones every day, morning and evening, marches and popular songs dear to every German. They lie engraven on our minds and will be the last thing in the lager, the camp, that we shall forget. They are the voice of the camp, the perceptible expression of its geometrical badness, of the resolution of others to annihilate us first as men in order to kill us more slowly afterwards. When this music plays, we know that our comrades out in the fog are marching like automatons. Their souls are dead, and the music drives them like the wind drives dead leaves and takes the place of their wills. Maybe, just maybe, this gives us a glimpse of what this space was. Not necessarily the Nazi perspective. So I think a very important aspect of this is not only to go and mourn, but then to listen to the voices who were there. Just random images that at this stage, for me, just to illustrate parts of the camp, the electrified barbed wire. And again, the almost beautiful nature of this particular place had you not known what had happened here. But then you're reminded. The worst part, I think, of Auschwitz I is Block 11 and out. This is the Gestapo prison inside the prison of Auschwitz I. And again, no photography here, but you do have survivor memories. So superimposing that gives you what becomes one of the worst parts of Auschwitz. I take probably 3 pictures in this building. I just couldn't do it. I felt trespassing and I felt like a voyeur. This is the torture center of Auschwitz, inside the camp. These are some of the cells and that kind of thing, and some of the imagery of the perpetrator, of the survivor remembering what had happened here. Outside the prison, these are the torture cells in the basement. The main cells here is the execution plaza here. It was very eerie to go back at night to this place, and I think maybe now might be a good. So punishment here in cells and dark cells or standing cells in these very small, narrow areas were really horrific, and I didn't photograph any of it. It was in Block 11 that the Nazis first tried their experiments with Zyklon B gas. And the difficulty here was these cells are open. They try to board up the windows and things, right, in this first experiment. Now the experiment happened by a fluke. A German officer came back. He had been drinking all night. He fell asleep in his garage, and the car kept running. And the carbon monoxide almost killed him. His friend pulled him out and saved him. At the same time, another friend had been using Zyklon B to delouse the clothes that were coming in from lice and that kind of stuff. And then someone had this brilliant idea, well, wait a minute, what if we combine one to the other and see what happens? And thus, they went here. Okay. So on September 3rd, 1941, they tried Zyklon B. It wasn't a sealed chamber, and so the gassing took somewhere between 36 and 42 hours to work. But it worked. Which leads now to gas chamber 1 in Auschwitz I. Now, when we first arrived, the parking lot is just about here, the campus to the right. And I'm with colleagues who have very little background in Holocaust studies. And we're looking to the right of the camp. When I left the bus, I immediately saw this, and I knew what it was. So this was the first gas chamber in Auschwitz. It's an above-ground gas chamber, which meant it was very loud. Let me walk you through a little of this and tell you what happens. About 3 or 4 weeks later, they begin to now experiment with Zyklon B gas on Soviet prisoners of war. And as I go back, as they're in session, I came back one morning, there's a small antechamber here, the gas chamber is in the back here, and here is the crematoria, and there's the smokestack for the crematoria. It's a relatively small, confined space. And I made the mistake that morning, I think in hindsight, of going in by myself. So I walked in, antechamber was disturbing, then I walked into the gas chamber with a ceiling about this high, and the whole world collapsed upon me at that moment. It was very, very difficult. So I escaped quickly through the crematoria, and then I hobbled myself back to the classroom, whereby, literally, I was shaking. You know, my body was in rebellion against me. And I didn't want to talk to anybody. It was only the second day we were together, and I hid in the back of the room. And time went by. And again, I didn't want to talk to anybody. We broke for lunch. We went to a restaurant across the street from Auschwitz. I didn't want to eat anything ever again in my lifetime is kind of where I was. So I ran to the back of the building where I thought I'd be safe, just to compose myself. But of course, that's where the bathrooms were. So everybody came to the bathroom, you know, and saw me in the back, you know, trying to compose myself. They brought me back to their table. My tall FBI agent friend was one of them. And said, "What's going on? What did you see? You snuck out." And I began to share with them what they didn't know about what they were going to experience the next day. As I shared that with them, I felt a tremendous burden lift. My appetite came back. I could live again. And why? Because now I had friends that were invested in the story with me. As a teacher, one of the things I always teach is that we can never do this thing alone. We're never islands. Remember the old Simon and Garfunkel song, right? I'm a rock, I'm an island? But the only way you make it in this world is if we rely on each other. And so suddenly that burden felt lifted, and I felt better. That story will play out, more importantly, I think, in Birkenau the next day. But let me tell you about this. Commandant Hurst described what went on in Auschwitz I at this gas chamber in testimony at the trials. While the transports were detraining, holes were pierced in the earth in the concrete ceiling of the mortuary. So first it was a mortuary, they then adapted it to the gas chamber. The Russians wanted to undress the anteroom, quietly enter the mortuary. They told they were going to be deloused, so they're learning how to do this. Fill the capacity, doors are sealed, gas shaken through holes in the roof with SS men with gas masks on. I don't know how long the killing took, he says. For a little while, a humming sound could be heard. When the powder was thrown in, there were cries of gas, a great bellowing, and the trapped prisoners hurled themselves against both doors. I'd read that a number of times. It never occurred to me to ask, how can the Commandant know this? Where was he to testify to this? So when I explored the geography of the camp a little bit more, the answer was fairly obvious. Next door to the gas chamber were the administrative of the secretaries, right? So they began to complain that the killing was just too noisy for them. They couldn't get their work done, and so the Nazis began to run motorcycle engines just outside here to kind of muffle the sound because it was too loud. The Commandant's office is right there. Of course he heard all of this. That is why he was there. So a truck is positioned outside to muffle the screams. That seems to help things. So as I walk around the perimeter here, and I think I'm just going to pause and then bring them back in for 1 second. Oop. They left, you think? Oh, okay. I'm very cautious. The last thing I want to do, especially children in the audience, is to become a perpetrator, right? So I'm very cautious of that. As I wandered the perimeter of Auschwitz one afternoon, I was just taking photographs, and then going back, I discovered this photograph that always just annoyed me. I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. So you have this villa, and here's the camp. What was that villa? This is the Commandant's house, Commandant Hurst. Here's the backyard. There's the camp wall. That is the Commandant and his family in Auschwitz, in this villa, having a wonderful family life. That's the wall of the camp. The villa is here. If you step out the door and take a right, you're at the administrative offices and the Commandant's headquarters. The gas chamber is right there. in his backyard. His children were told every morning by the mother, make sure when you get the vegetables from the garden that you clean them off so the dust isn't on them. And the children could hear the screaming every day, 50 yards out of their windows. Which is why, for me, books and films such as The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, forgive me, are what I call Holocaust pornography. To claim that the Nazis had no clue, the children didn't know what was going on, and the horror of this story, if you know the story, is that somehow we should feel very emotional that the Nazi child would get killed. Sure, any child who dies. That's emotional manipulation to ignore the culpability of the perpetrator who is embracing this as a positive aspect of their lives. Just so that you know, when Hearst was tried and convicted of war crimes, the Russians hung him between his backyard and the gas chamber. And that's where he was executed. So I came to this moment. This is the end of Auschwitz I for me. And I was kind of very down. I was alone again and wandered through the camp. And I looked up and this is the place. Remember the children come out of Auschwitz at the end of the war? You may have seen film, and I knew exactly where this was. And I got the very photograph I always wanted to use in any Holocaust presentation, and was mortified that I had found something so aesthetically pleasing for a presentation. So I sat there in this confused state of why am I photographing, and aren't I glad I got this when I got home. And it was at that moment, in kind of a despairing moment, that I remembered what had happened here so long ago. And I'm thinking about those children, and out of nowhere, the voice of Professor Wiesel comes into my mind. And I remember a quote he said. And he said, because I remember I despair, because I remember I have the duty to reject despair. At that moment, as that voice comes into my head, and I'm thinking about that, I thought, I'm a visitor here. If someone who actually survived here can embrace this, who am I not to? And how does that inform this journey for me? And it began to inform my journey and this presentation, I think, as well. Which is critically important because the next day was Birkenau.
Can I have a question?
Absolutely.
When he says, I have the duty to reject despair, but duty doesn't mean he rejects it. He thinks he should reject it, that's all.
What do you think, what duty is he talking about that calls him, do you think?
Well, the duty to stay alive.
You're right.
Yeah. But Primo Levi wasn't successful in doing that.
He could never escape, or he was never liberated from the camp. And I would argue Wiesel never is either. Is any other idea what that duty might be that he's talking about? Yeah.
Well, in the face of something so horrific, to keep going, to persevere in a positive way.
Absolutely. Wonderful, yes.
Well, it's sort of don't let the perpetrators win, in a sense, by doing that. You kind of.
Absolutely, and there's an anger there, isn't there? You're not going to let them win. I have a duty not to let them win. So there's a humanity here, of resistance, of fighting, of struggle. Any other thoughts? Maybe his religious duty. Not to abandon his faith, perhaps, right? There are many ways to look at this. And for me, to me, that was key. Because his whole life has been dedicated to helping others, right? And to make sure this doesn't happen to other people. And that's a very powerful mission and message to send. Now, Birkenau, the first impression you have of this is its enormous scope. It dwarfs Auschwitz I, and I didn't expect that. I mean, I knew the figures, but until you're there, you don't realize how enormous it is. Camp construction begins in 1941. I think it's 7 villages are leveled in this plain. The bricks of them are used to make some of the buildings in Auschwitz. And here's a layout of the camp. So here's Auschwitz I. And here's Auschwitz II, Birkenau. Birkenau means birch tree, right, in the language. And here's Auschwitz III, which becomes a slave labor camp by German industry, which is the largest of the 3 camps. The only railway tracks added here were these in 1944 to speed up the killing of the Hungarian Jews that Wiesel talks about. This is Auschwitz III Buna, and as you can see, what the Nazis are doing is collaborating with German industry to make a massive industrial complex that still exists and functions that way today. When we were in our hotel, there was these huge pipes coming in from the countryside. And I said, what is that, you know, naively? And he said, oh, that's where your hot water comes from. I said, well, where does it come from? Oh, it comes from Buna. So it's still an industrial center in Polish life. This bothers me tremendously because what you have here is unregulated business making a profit on human beings. To me, that is a mindset of a perpetrator. So at the selection ramp, as I stand there and look around, and I cannot see the end of the camp in any direction. Except for the gate, I can see the Birkenau gate there. And the Nazis were expanding the camp in 1944 to add another gas chamber before the Russians arrived. And at the selection ramp, I looked across and I saw this little water cistern. I couldn't equate what I was looking at. The Germans didn't give water to Jews arriving on these transports. It made no sense to me. So I asked, and my guide said, oh, no, no. Didn't you realize that Auschwitz was insured against fire? And to get the insurance policy, these cisterns are all throughout the camp, so when the local fire department comes, they can put out the fire. In this direction are gas chamber 2 and 3 where they're burning human beings. And yet, Allianz insures Auschwitz against fire. "51 companies use slave labor from Auschwitz in more than 40 subcamps around Auschwitz. And they make money. Again, there's something very disconcerting when you see unregulated business using humanity for profit. It's unacceptable in any moral sense. So what is the moral universe of the perpetrator? What I want to show you now is how the camp was constructed to reinforce their worldview, to make their job easier and self-reinforcing. To begin, we have discovered recently, past 5-6 years I think, these photographs from the Commandant's adjutant, who is taking sort of memory images of the good days in Auschwitz. And I'll just pick out one of these photographs here. German women who in their tens of thousands have gone east to volunteer for the German war machine. From midwives to secretaries to nurses to teachers to secretaries at Auschwitz, from the best German families, to do this very difficult work. On the back it says, it began to rain. Here they are at a resort camp, probably about 2.5 miles outside of Auschwitz-Birkenau, taking a little break from their hard work. It's a very human kind of moment until you realize who these people are. In contrast, I try to find an image taken within the week or two of that photograph being taken, and you look at women who have an entirely different experience at Birkenau because their lives don't matter. So we have the women and children arriving here from Hungary. They've already been selected. You'll see women and children. If I only leave you with that image, I've set up a dynamic of perpetrator power and weakness of the victim. So I want to get out of that false dynamic and give them their lives back and show the photographs of their lives that they thought were valuable and precious as well. When you start looking at these two universes, you start to realize both of them exist very comfortably in the real world. You can justify any violence against someone else. You can go to bed at night, you can sing, party, have a wonderful time with pretty secretaries because you're doing very difficult but important work. And yet, it's to fellow human beings. So, standing here at the Birkenau gate, we're looking down here. This is a selection ramp here. And I'm going to walk you through the camp very briefly. So we're standing here currently. The men's quarantine camp, when they arrive, they're quarantined here, and these are the barracks. And again, what can you take from this? Well, a couple of things. These are all prefabricated buildings. They were made for cattle, for horses. And so when the Nazis contracted out these things to a subcontractor, the subcontractor, to fill the contract, built the entire structure. You're going to see down throughout here the little stuff for the horses to be tied to. Right? So you had to get paid for your work. It all had to be, you know, how these business contracts work. Reclaim the space, perhaps, the survivor's memory of what this may have been. But then you start to realize that these were built relatively quickly by companies trying to make money. And the SS would check and pay them, of course. And it took about 20 subcontractors from Germany to make one of these huts or buildings. We're looking back at the Birkenau Gate from the end of the camp. And again, my presentation has come together over time, and I have all these images of Birkenau that I don't know what to do with. And it's at this moment where I decided I know what I was going to do. There was a series of photographs taken illegally by two Nazi photographers who worked in Auschwitz. They knew Auschwitz was closing, the Russians were closing in, and they wanted to remember all the good work they had done there. So they're making a memory book for the camp commandant. Okay? So these are professional photographers. I've never used these photographs before because they're always out of context. If you just see them through the eyes of the perpetrator, you have an entire myth of what they're trying to show you. I can never figure out how to use them. And then it clicked, and this is how I can reclaim the space. When I'm about to superimpose those photographs over mine to reclaim the space back and remove me from it, I want you to ask yourself, what are the motives of the perpetrators? What are they seeing in this universe they have created? Photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one. So the cautions about using Nazi photography. Recognizing the thing I didn't realize was that for many Jewish families, this is the only photograph they have of their families. Very few Jews leave Europe with family belongings. The Nazis confiscate everything. So often you'll have Jewish families recognizing a grandmother or a mother, and it's the only image they have of their family. So there's a preciousness there. But as I've already shown you in that Auschwitz I photograph of the orchestra, we have to go beyond simply using them to authenticate the space. We have to do much better than that, I think. Recognize what the perpetrators were dwelling in and why they wanted to bear witness by photographing it. What were they bearing witness to? The Nazis used photography as a weapon. In 1933, they began to photograph anybody in Germany who wasn't complying with the April 1st boycott in 1933. And they were telling people this, we want your picture, right? So automatically the Nazis are using this as a weapon. Their photographers attached in the field, literally the German word for what they were doing were weapons, right? So there's a propaganda aspect of this. Except I don't think that plays out here. They know the war is coming to an end. This is a memory piece, not a propaganda piece. The power of the place you're about to see illustrated is deliberately designed to reinforce behaviors and expectations of both perpetrators and victims. Victims in Auschwitz have no choice. The photographer does. But seeing the camera in the hands of a Nazi cameraman, what did that do to you? If someone's about to take your photograph, how does that influence your behavior as you look at these photographs as well? So you have an image like this, taken at the selection ramp by one of these Nazi photographers. The woman looking directly at the photographer, she has no idea what's happening to her. This happened so fast. The photographer certainly knows what's about to happen because she's being selected. But what is she thinking when she looks at the photographer is very interesting to me. When I show you an image the Nazi perpetrator takes for his memory piece of the selection, you may be surprised by what you see. So for a moment, what do you observe about the Nazi process of mass murder as depicted in this perpetrator photograph of the most horrific moment, the tearing apart of families, the selection? Describe for me what you see here going on.
It's business as usual.
Okay, so we have almost this disturbing comment, right? Business, perfect, as usual. There's some kind of normalcy here. Thank you. What else do you see here?
A certain protocol.
Explain.
Tied in. Well, there's
Yeah. No, you have certain roles to play, right? You have the Nazis here. You have these folks who seem to be well-fed, who are clearly prison inmates. These are part of the Sonderkommando, if we know what those are about. What else do you observe about the process?
I don't see any guns anywhere.
Yeah, the only thing you see are these canes, right?
Yeah.
Which clearly we know are going to be used later, but where are the weapons? Nowhere. What else? Excellent observation. What else? Give me some adjectives to describe the moment in this photograph.
About the banality of evil.
Oh, Hannah Arendt. the banality of evil. This seems very normal,
Yeah.
very businesslike, as you said, right? And that's exactly the point. What the Nazis are photographing is how proud they are of the trick they've created to fool the victim. Because the victim is arriving with expectations about their next hour. They're looking at this enormous camp and buildings and saying, yes, I'm going to be housed here. And the Nazis are using that very expectation against them, to subdue them. And the Nazis are very proud of this, right? And that's what they're photographing. If you look more carefully, what would happen oftentimes is Sonderkommando and even the Nazi officers would walk up and say, can we take your luggage? Can we help you? You'll be moving into that camp. It was done very... Now, I had a chilly reminder, and I know Patty will remember this as well, but in Bosnia, there's this terrific film imagery in color, I think shot by CNN, I forgot who by. And Slobodan Milosevic is gathering up people to be murdered, right? And a bus has arrived, and he starts to separate them, women and children. And immediately on their faces, they're terrified. They've heard this before. And he walks up to them and he says, don't worry. You know, we just want to take care of you. It's easy. And he begins to reassure them all. And the crowd begins to calm down. And then you start hearing the machine guns. Right? The perpetrators learn how to do this. They do it for themselves and against their victim. If I showed you that and showed you this as Auschwitz, would you understand Auschwitz? No, you'd have a perpetrator perspective.
But is that really representative? Because there are other pictures also which are horrific. And I actually, when I was in Auschwitz, our guide said that that place is actually for Holocaust survivors the most difficult place to go because it was so wrenching to be separated from your family. So I was wondering whether you picked here like a...
No, and what I love so much what you just said, right? We are looking at incredible violence, humiliating, agonizing, torturous violence. And yet the words we're using, business, apathy, banality, in the most horrific, violent moment of separation, right?
A real air of civility. You see a real air of civility.
Right. And the perpetrator universe, that's exactly how they live. Yeah.
I was in Germany. I was in the Air Force, and I was in Germany very shortly after the war was over on May 8th, 1945. I went to Hamburg and Berlin and I think one or two other places in Germany. We never heard anything about this. We didn't hear about it until I saw pictures that Margaret Burke-White took in the Life magazine some months later after I flew home to the United States. Why was this terrible thing kept a secret? And it must have been conscious because it was so huge. How was it kept secret?
There are a number of issues that play out, and I can't cover. I'll just touch on a few.
Could you speak a little louder?
Sure. A couple things happened. At that moment in time, photography as evidence was never really accepted, right, by print journalists. With the Auschwitz picture you just mentioned, they, for the first time, now have a level of respectability. So on one hand, the journalists during the war could never publicize these crimes, especially the photography, because they didn't have a second verifying source. That's how journalism works. So there's this aspect of we can't really prove it with a secondary source, and photography itself isn't our first venue. The print is more important. Well, that begins to shift now with what you're talking about. The photographs are being distributed. So now you're talking about coming to terms with an unreality. How do you perceive this with the very problems we're facing, perceiving it through these photographs, right? The photographs you're mentioning, I think, are the mobile killing squad photographs, where you're actually seeing the killings done, and they become horrific, and many of those show up early on after the war. They become very horrific. But how can you live with those? Right? You see them.
Edward R. Murrow broadcast from the camp.
He did. He absolutely did. You hear it, you're shocked by it, and then what do? I've got to move on. This will never happen again. Never again. And you bury it because you have to psychologically. Germans after the war, we were buying the line because we wanted to that this was done by Hitler and henchmen, and the average German really didn't know what was going on. Every German knew what was going on. It's a false question we're asking here. So there are a lot of factors at play. Add to that, of course, the post-war reality of NATO versus the Warsaw Pact to come, and the Russians are our new enemy. I think a lot of it is psychological, though, where you're exposed to it. Were you ever given the photographs that were distributed to the U.S. military by Eisenhower? Did you ever get that collection as well? Eisenhower sent out photographs from the camps, basically saying that in 10 years we'll all forget this ever happened, and I don't want that ever happened, so these photographs are used sort of as a memory piece. But there's a lot going on here. As an occupying force in a country, in Germany after the war, the Germans aren't going to be speaking about it either. So there are a lot of factors at play. But I think a lot of it was psychological. We need to move on. We need to forget this and make a better world. But I don't think you can. And I think you make a better world by remembering it, and especially examining how the perpetrator justified it. If you notice carefully here, he selected that woman and child to go here. I had no idea where here was until standing there. There's a very eerie feeling where you're standing and taking photographs with a Nazi war. And I know exactly what's over here. This is crematoria 2. But it's interesting to me the perpetrator does not include that in his photograph. Is it because he doesn't want to be prosecuted after the war for war crimes? No, it's disguised as a bakery. If you just see the photograph, I think it's psychological. He wants to show this. There are no images in the gas chambers, not even inside the gates of the gas chamber areas, but only this universe that he's framing.
You know, it's very hard for me to look at a photograph when we have a knowledge of what's happening. And if we take one step into the shadow of this man, the tension and the awfulness is there. I can't remove myself because of a photograph.
Thank God. So I came across this picture in my archive of images, and again, it's one of these moments where I was very pleased with what I had. These are some of my friends. We were subdivided into groups. The black umbrellas against this, to me, was an aesthetically perfect moment. And again, I was horrified. So I'm thinking of images that horrified me. And I thought, how do I reclaim that space as theirs, not ours? We're only visitors here. So I began to superimpose. And this is where I think I can now use the images effectively. This is taken that same couple of days here, showing the selection process. Yes, you could, in context, without context, say it's an orderly process, but add sound, add smell, right? You suddenly change the dynamic here. You can't just look at it from the perpetrator's point of view. To illustrate that more, May 1944, a mother who is capable of working is being directed by an SS officer to a crematory too, because she's refused to part with her baby. The first targets are the children. And the mother doesn't know that. There's another image that I know of, and it may very well be this woman, but I'm not sure. There's another image I can actually break down that I don't use, where literally the daughter tells the story of her mother sensing what was going on, asking for her grandchild. And the grandmother and the grandchild walked to crematoria too, and the daughter survived. The only image that woman has of her mother and her daughter was taken by a Nazi at Auschwitz. To me, though, in the horror here of hell, I see loving humanity as well. I'm at the back of the camp now. On my left is crematoria 3, on my right crematoria 2. They're mirror images of each other. This platform has been added as a memorial after the war. But again, we superimpose those images to see the horror of the perpetrator's world. Monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries, ready to believe and to act without asking any questions, says survivor Primo Levi. I'm going to kind of wrap this up now and then field some questions here. So this is the selection ramp here. And look at these images taken by the Nazis. If you just had this after the selection taking place, these women have been selected to go to the camp to work. If you just use that image, it looks like they're going on a stroll in a park somewhere. As soon as they enter these gates they're facing, their life is going to be destroyed. But not in the perpetrator's world. You'll notice behind them as we're looking ahead, where are we heading? all their luggage and belongings. Part of the process was loot. All this stuff is going home to Germany. I'm trying to see what to look at. So loot and plunder is processed. The trains have arrived. You'll notice there are no lines of people. They've already gone through the gas chamber or selection, and now the Nazis come in and begin to take the materials to send them home. I came across a document, by the way, in Auschwitz. We went to some of the archives of someone who didn't pay their rent back in Germany who had been shipped to Auschwitz, and so the electric company, the lights are left on, was billing the SS in Auschwitz for the bill. The suitcases in Auschwitz I, with all the names written on them, right? We're going to return them to you. Why bring suitcases? It tells you something about what the targets expected. They're going to arrive and they're going to start a life anew. It might be difficult, right? Why do the Nazis do it? It saves manpower. If you round up Jews, often they would say there are partisans a mile away, they're coming toward you, we need to move you to a safer place. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings. What that allows you to do is, when they arrive at a site like Auschwitz, plunder is easy, because you've now grabbed all your personal and most precious belongings and deposited them. You don't need to spend troops going through old houses and stuff. All the stuff you need is being brought to you. The victim doesn't know that. In the back of the camp between the gas chambers is this building that to me looked like a schoolhouse. That's how I believed it was designed, and the contract won by the contractor. The Nazis called it the sauna, this Nazi name. Sauna sounds good. This is the processing place of Auschwitz where you're tattooed, head shaved, etc. When you go into the sauna, it's now been restored. As you go through it, above the door, examination room, where the doctor will examine you to find gold fillings or whatever they can extract from you. The beauty salon, where your head is shaved so that your hair can be used for mattresses for German submarines. Or here, the showers, where you're hit with this bizarre mixture of stuff and then thrown into the camp that hopefully will delight you before you enter the camp. It was here where it really became difficult, even more difficult. I mean, at the gas chambers, when we went through there, I'm not using any of those images yet. I was shaking, I couldn't breathe. I was next to an African police commissioner who said, had I been here, I would have worked for the Nazis. As a policeman, he was talking about his role and where he would have perceived himself. I was having a very difficult time. It became very personal for me in the sauna. I just want to share this story with you because it's very important to me. Outside the sauna, what was known as Canada, where all the riches were stored, you can see where the Russians liberated the camp that these are overflowing. They couldn't get back to Germany fast enough. This image taken is as close as those photographers got to the killing process, because they're standing here outside of Canada, in gas chamber 3 and 4 are right here. They're waiting to go in. They have no idea what they're looking at because the buildings look like bakeries. The memorial here at the end of the tracks. The camp is laid out specifically to allow the perpetrators to do what they want to do, both for themselves and to their victims. When you are selected, it was very orderly, not very strenuous, says the Nazi, who's now on trial. The victim says everything was going very, very fast, yelling, screaming. It's two opposite realities in the same spot. Taken from the opposite guard tower was this image after the selection, and now they're not going into the camp, they're heading to crematoria 2. The walk from the selection ramp to the crematoria in the back, I wish I have it in my little journal that I was writing, and I haven't looked it up. It felt like 8 to 10 minutes. You can imagine the psychological effect of the construct of the camp that would reinforce, as you look on either side, all the buildings, that you're going to be okay. It's part of the process of the design of the camp. So as the selection takes place, this image taken from the guard tower shows this barbed wire here, but it also shows crematoria 2. The gas chambers in Auschwitz II are below ground. They learned that lesson in Auschwitz I. Above ground are the crematoria. So as you walk along the selection ramp toward the two gas chambers in this particular part of the camp, this is again taken by the Nazi photographer, and you see behind it gas chamber 3, crematoria 3 actually, gas chambers down below. And these images of women and children, again, I could never use these out of context, but they spoke to me a lot when I try to reclaim this space and its memory back. The closest picture I could get to the gas chamber was this one. Hungarian Jews, women and children. This is too difficult sometimes, but back of the camp were these little gates all over the camp as if you're entering a park. The final deception. So what happened, you see the gate there, you would then come to the end, you would take this turn, and the changing room was right in front of you. You would go down into the changing room, into the gas chamber. You had no idea. So you have these gates all throughout the back of the camp. So here's a changing room, here's the gate that they would have gone through, down into the changing room. Gas chambers here, the crematoria above. These images were taken by the construction company to show the progress of the contract, to assure that they get paid for the work that they're doing. Often their company name is emblazoned on the construction. Crematoria 4 was blown up by the Sonderkommando. This was one of the incredible rebellions in the camp. Every camp had a rebellion. And in this case, they blew up gas chamber 4. After these women and children entered. We only have 3 pictures that come out from the underground inside of Auschwitz. They were smuggled to the Western world. We knew what was going on in the camps. And what this photograph is showing is that the crematoria was so overflowing, they had to burn the bodies against this wire here. It was just being clogged up too much. And Wiesel mentions that right away. He mentions the burning bodies when he arrives. This is an aerial photography during the war. This was taken in a cone camera of a bomber heading to Buna, the industrial plant that we were bombing. After the war, these photographs were analyzed and labeled. For those who remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, the labels will look exactly the same. Because it's after the war that the fellow who looked at those maps of Cuba then looked back on these maps to discover what was in them. And you start to see the crematoria gas chambers labeled. So this was not labeled during the war. They didn't even look at that. They were looking ahead on the film reel to look at the bomb damage at Buna. It was only after the war we discovered these images and what they meant. All the gas chambers were blown up by the Nazis upon retreat so that the evidence is destroyed. These are the blueprints that you'll see go through 2 or 3 or 4 iterations as they figure out the best way to close a door in a gas chamber, or where the best place to conceal a staircase, and on it went. So this is a dialogue between the contractor and the SS. And then when the project was done, you get your final payment. So this is the evidence of the project being completed. I want to leave you with my last story and then let the survivor have the last word. So in the sauna, I'm in a very desperate place. I remember having a hard time catching my breath. And I turned the corner and saw this permanent exhibit that's there. And I had no idea it was there. And it is done by a very, very close friend of mine. Her name is Anne. Anne had been in Auschwitz and discovered a lot of the photographs that were taken from the victims. They were in a huge building that were stored, and she began to take them out and document them and tell the stories of the people that she could in her book called The Last Album, that she mentions the Cohen Center and our work. Very close friend, and I knew her work. I had no idea it was there. When I turned the corner and saw those faces, it became instantly personal. It was my friend Anne. Her mother crawled out of an execution pit in Poland, survived only because a Polish farmer hid her. I've been to see Anne's family and grandkids in Israel, and suddenly became from symbolic to really personal and real. And this is where I fell to pieces for the first time, literally fell to pieces. So I got out of there. I couldn't face it. And so I forced the first door I could open into a wet, rainy day. It was miserable. That's what I want. But then I remembered the previous day of gas chamber 1. where I, by myself, tried to deal with this and couldn't. I remember jimmying the door back open, forcing myself in, and here was my dilemma. That night, I'm doing the debrief for these diplomats about their trip to Birkenau. I'll be very honest. Two things went through my mind. I'm a man, they can't see me crying. Can you imagine? And the second thing was, how will they ever respect me as their teacher if I'm a blithering idiot who can't handle what they were witnessing? And I thought, those are ridiculous thoughts. I forced my way back in to confront all of this, and this fellow from Ecuador, whose name was Jose. Jose gives me a tremendous embrace as I'm crying. And I bring them out afterward, and I talk, and you have to understand what I'm wrestling with. I don't want this to be about me. And so I'm trying to control myself, and it's suddenly becoming about me, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm explaining to them what's happening, and it occurred to me that in an hour we get together, here's what I'm going to tell them. I had told them the Auschwitz one story, the crematoria, about how you need people, and how, Jose, you are my buddy. Without you, man, I could never have made it. I leaned on you. Jose looked in confusion. He back, what are you talking about? He had no idea I was going through this whole dilemma. He said, you were there for me. I was falling to pieces. You forget it works both ways. I want to show you Anne. I debated this for the longest time. I'm going to show you Anne, who put this exhibit together, whose mother was a survivor. I don't do this to reclaim the space for hers. Those faces belong there. But I want to connect you with a living human face so that the memory projects into the future. So this is Anne. She and I, in of all places, Las Vegas. Right? We had a conference there. I didn't want to go, but we ended up being together. It was there. I had been back for about 5 or 6 months. I had not yet told her the story about what her exhibit had done to me. I wanted to tell her personally. So we spent about 3 hours together, and I told her that just after this photo was taken. So we leave with, I hope, and how we make our lives better. And we do it through others. This is the policeman that I mentioned who said he would have worked at Auschwitz. This is, again, my Muslim friends, another Jim Waller, who runs the Auschwitz Institute on Peace and Reconciliation, who's our colleague at Keene State College. I'm very indebted to Jim for inviting me as an observer. You see many Muslims in the room as well dealing with this. I hope to God we can deal with Islamophobia. The face for me is Vahid Namanovich, who's a very dear friend who works at our summer institute. Vahidin survived the camps in Bosnia. He, like Holocaust survivors I deal with, want to get even in the worst way. Hated the perpetrator and visualized and imagined ways to get even. Until Vahidin came to Brattleboro, Vermont, to SIT, and was taught how to let go of that hatred because the only one being affected by it is him. The perpetrators don't care. And Vahidin has come to this moment, he's a Muslim imam, and he's come to this place and moment of, I must heal. His work is in Bosnia, dealing with second generation who refuse to give up the memory of their parents. They feel they don't have the right, and the hatred goes to the next generation. So he deals with the next generation, Muslim, Croat, Serb, Bosnian, all together. He's making tremendous strides in forgiveness and hope, and he's my face of a Muslim when I hear the horrific stuff about Islamophobia in this country.
Yep.
So with that in mind, I want to leave you with one last voice. And it's not mine. Where do we go from here? Perpetrators operate in their own moral universe. They sleep well at night. We must be outraged by that. We can't dismiss it and normalize it and move on. We must make it a part of ourselves and say, when I recognize hatred and bigotry and racism and otherness, I can't accept it. And to choose life. I remember in Israel, I often asked survivors, and I had another Bosnian friend, I just remembered with me at the time, who would go to every survivor. One of them was Anne Frank's friend, who was with her in Bergen-Belsen. How did you get even was the question. I just listened, you know. So my Bosnian survivor, how'd you get even after the war? Every Holocaust survivor in that room answered the same way. We had children. And my Bosnian friend said, that's really nice, but seriously, how'd you make those bastards pay? We have grandchildren. What's the message? We could very well have killed every one of them, and everybody would have looked the other way, and we would have become them. Instead, we choose life.
כשהרוסים כבר היו קרובים מאוד לקובנה, אז הגרמנים החליטו לחסל את שארית הגטו. הביאו אותנו לתחנת הרכבת, שזה היה בקצה השני של העיר. אינני יודע כמה היו בתוך הקרון, 50 אולי 100. כולם ידעו שהנסיעה הזו זה למחנות ההשמדה, זה לא היה ספק. אני יכול להעיד שלא הייתה שום היסטריה. זאת אומרת, למרות כל המקום החנוק הזה, הנה עכשיו אני אפילו מרגיש את הריח, ובכל זאת אנשים שומרים על צלם אנוש. הרכבת התחילה לזוז, ופה קרה דבר מפתיע. אחד האנשים רץ לאשנב ובכוח בלתי רגיל קרע את חוטי התיל מהאשנב הזה וניסה לדחוף את עצמו ולא יכול היה. הייתי אז בגיל 14, מאוד רזה, כמו רוב האנשים במחנה הגטו, והיא אמרה, אם יהיה מישהו שישאר בחיים ויוכל לספר את מה שקרה לנו, זה יהיה אתה. אבי אמר, כן, אתה הולך, והוא בדרך המחושבת שלו קם ומרים אותי, ולא רק זה, והיא אומר לי, אני אוציא אותך מהרגליים, תוציא את הרגליים, מה איתך, את הרגליים? ואני זוכר את התנועה הזו, כי התנועה הזו ממש בנפשי, סיבבתי את ראשי ורציתי עוד חיבוק, עוד משהו. הפרידה נוראית, כל מי שאהבתי הולך למחנות ההשמדה. במקום זה, בצורה מאוד רגועה, כנראה שהוא רצה להקרין בי שקט נפשי. הוא אמר לי, du sollst sein ein Mensch, ודחף אותי החוצה. את אמי לקחו לשטוטהוף, למשרפות, ובאותו היום גם את סבי והסבתא וכל המשפחה האחרת נרצחו באוויר בדכאו עם אותו גורל. הציווי הזה של אבי, שיהיה בן אדם, או זה היה מנץ', תמצאת לי את מלאך החיים, וזה לא חשוב שאני אהיה פרופסור, מה שנהפכתי, או סמלה, אבל שאני אהיה בן אדם. ואני רק מקווה שעד לרגע האחרון הוא הרגיש וידע שנשארתי ואני באמת הולך בציווי הזה.
I think all of you can read in your own thoughts on that. For me, the father could have said something quite different. Never forget. Never let them forget. Get even. Instead he said, be a good person. And that's how I want to end my presentation. Thank you.
Please, ask all your questions, make it brief, so we can answer as many questions as there are before it's too late. Any question?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that I'm so touched by the depth of your sensitivity to this subject, and it's so moving to me. All of the questions you asked yourself, and I just wanted to thank you for that. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I guess this has been discussed ad infinitum, but why would they feel that they needed to create such technology to exterminate people? And there certainly would be easier, more efficient ways to do it. I mean, the Russians just shot people as they got off the train, but is this something in the historical German character about becoming industrialized?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Could you repeat it?
The question was, how come they create this elaborate killing process, right? Aren't there other ways to kill? Why go technologically into this kind of thing? A couple of things to consider, and I try to give you some context and scope, that there are 42,500 camps. The majority of Jews who are murdered, and other targets of the Nazis as well, are not killed in the gas chambers. They're killed by starvation, by mass shootings. On the Eastern Front, more are killed that way than are in gas chambers. So the gas chamber can't become the symbol. So what happens here? I would argue that the Nazis didn't really know where they were going and discovered where they always wanted to be when they created Birkenau. Up until then, they tried everything. Forced emigration, which was the early policy, to discrimination, isolation, to, maybe a little bit of murder, maybe whatever, and eventually it gets to this process. Why does it get to this kind of process at the end? Bullets are too expensive. Psychologically, the shooting squads are breaking down. This becomes an easier mechanism in the killing process, not for the victim, but for the killer. It's based on, initially, the T4 program in Germany that were killing German handicapped. Part of the Nazi racial idea is that you had to cleanse the Aryan of all kind of deformities, of blood and race and this nonsense. So the T4 doctors, when that was publicly discovered in Germany that they were doing this, at this time 70,000 had been killed in pre-existing psychiatric hospitals. And they were killing Germans, and people found out. So Hitler publicly cancels the T4 program. And yet he's got an infrastructure of experts who now know how to kill using gas chambers and crematoria. And the SS are begging for easier, quicker ways to kill because our shooting squads are breaking down. So it's a progression of a lot of different points that come together that simply at the end make it easier for the perpetrator to do the work he wants to do. I'm not sure if that answers it, but it gets a starting point perhaps of this. Thank you. Yes?
In working with young people, could you tell us one or two of the biggest challenges you have?
Thank you. It depends on age group. So I do this with elementary school kids, middle school kids, adult education classes, and so on and so forth. If I'm teaching this to younger kids, I'm teaching something quite different. I don't show the horror. That's my decision. And what I'm talking about is how we other human beings. And often I do that through identity exercises, where one of the issues I think we all wrestle with, especially kids growing up, is we're trying to find out who we are. And we often define that in sort of an enclosed shell. We finally put ourselves together and we kind of know who we are, and there I am, exclusive of things around us. And so I often say that's an identity that's kind of closed off, right? That's exclusive. Monotheistic traditions tend to reinforce that. We have the truth in our religious tradition, and it's up to us to share it with you in the world. So one of the ways I try to get around that is, and we deal with identity, are you threatened by diversity, or do you see it as an opportunity? So one of the stories I tell them was that I was in Israel once, and on the side of the road, a forest was dying. It was all blackened and dying. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, a Hamas or Hezbollah rocket came in and hit here. And so I told my driver, I'm very sorry what had happened. I want to recognize, you're facing terrorists. And he said, what are you talking about? He says, when we first came here, we were really stupid. We wanted to plant trees to grab the soil. So we planted like 1,000 elm trees or something, And then a disease came and they all died. Now we're smart, he says. We plant 10, 15 varieties of trees in one spot. So if a disease hits, only a few of the trees die and the others thrive. I thought, what a terrific metaphor for human life. The more our life is enriched by those who are different from us, the less susceptible we are to the virus of hatred and bigotry that would kill us, I think. So that's how I deal with sort of younger kids. There are very interesting stories. I do a lesson for middle school kids about othering other people, and I go back sometimes the next day. It's immediate, the reaction. Kids immediately say that some rumor is spread against a kid, or somebody shoved against a locker. Hey, stop that. That's what Mr. Rett was talking about yesterday. We can't let that happen. Education is our greatest weapon, and it can and will and is changing this kind of stuff. We have to be very honest with what we're confronting. So it changes with whatever group I'm talking to. You noticed how I really didn't want him to see what was going on here today. And again, that was very, we talked beforehand about that as well. Yes.
Yes.
Can
you explain to me how a culture like Germany, the culture of Goethe, Schiller, Bach, Beethoven, deteriorated to this kind of monstrosity?
Oh, Patty, I might throw that your way. This is the question we all wrestle with, and I think the answer to that is, If a leader comes to power who has an ideology of exclusion, whose purpose is to eliminate people who disagree with him, any culture at any time can walk down that path. And that's the chilling reality of the perpetrator mentality. The majority of perpetrators aren't psychopaths. They try to figure that they aren't psychopaths. They tried to figure that out at Nuremberg, right? They gave them all psychological tests and found out that all of them were not only normal, but high functioning with families, with one exception, right? Which was Rudolf Hess, who was just off the charts. It was Hess. It was the editor of Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher. So that is the chilling observation. So I don't say this is a German phenomenon as much as it is a human challenge. Once you recognize that, I think it's really helpful to look at the construction of the perpetrator mindset that allows you to dismiss other people and then use the mechanisms of government and society to reinforce that kind of ideology. So as a democratic society, when political candidates are spewing hatred, bigotry, exclusion, otherness, does that mean we're Nazi Germany? No. But it means we are informed by Nazi Germany to witness those people suffering, to mourn, and be proactive. We can't simply look the other way. That's my simple answer to the question of all the work that we do.
Well, a simpler answer, I think, is it's easy to address social, economic problems by pointing to its people.
Yeah.
What was that?
It's easy to address problems in society, economic, social, by identifying a group of people. What's difficult in that analysis here, that in Germany, Jews made up less than a half percentage point of the population. A third of them lived in one city, Berlin. Most were assimilated, looked, spoke, and were German for generations. So racism, or sort of targeting the outsider, doesn't necessarily tell the story of what happened in early Nazi Germany. So yes, you're right in what you say, absolutely. And yet, there's this other dynamic of the perpetrator that's totally exclusive of that dynamic, and just raises more challenges for us. The lady back here had a question before.
Oh, I wanted to comment. Have you heard of the artist Ai Weiwei? He's a Chinese installation artist.
Oh, yes.
And he's actually under house arrest because his work is political. And I had to go to Alcatraz last winter because he had an installations that they shipped all the way from China to show at Alcatraz. And I'd seen Alcatraz before from across the bay, from Sausalito, and from a distance it looks, like a prison.
Yep.
And you mentioned earlier the irony of the beauty of the architecture and the layout of Auschwitz, and that's exactly what happened with my experience. I took a ferry to this island, and like you say, the architecture, the pathways, the gardens, the lighting, and the installations were incredibly powerful. I won't go into detail, but if anybody's interested, I'd be more than happy to share them. But it was extremely powerful. But through the whole thing was this conflicting feeling, because it was beautiful, but at the same time powerfully disturbing.
What a fascinating connection you've made, right? And I think
Yeah.
how I would wrestle with that wonderful observation, because it's spot on, is the problem with genocide and mass atrocity is, when do normal societal behaviors, all humans are bigoted, we all have that, that's how human beings operate. When are those normal things, prison structures, that effectively help us imprison people, right? When do those become genocidal? When do those stop being normal societal functioning and slip down the path toward genocide?
Well, and a lot of the installations were in actual prison cells.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did make an album of it on Facebook, and I would be happy to share it with anybody interested.
I love that connection. I think it's a fabulous thing to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Especially given our culture that I would argue disproportionately imprisons one segment of our society much more than any other. It raises fundamental questions for us that we must wrestle with.
I will be very happy to get your name and put your information into our website,
Okay.
So anybody who wants to go to the website and read about your
Great,
suggestion.
great.
Yeah,
Let
I'll
him
see someone
first,
who asked. I'm gonna ask someone who hasn't
go
had a
first.
chance yet, and then,
Why don't you go first?
good, no, they're back, all right, you're it. You're up.
No, you had.
Okay. I'd like to go just for a moment to that point when you were feeling very emotional and your friend and you hugged each other and, you know, you were feeling bad about feeling emotional or feeling maybe a weakness. What I would say is, you know, it's such a human reaction, normal reaction to be emotional in that situation. Matter of fact, Ian's art there, I think, would be bringing that out. And that's one of the reasons, I think, to let your humanity come out and express that emotion, because it's a normal feeling. It's a normal expression of feeling, and I think it's healthy, you know, to express
Thank you.
that.
I agree,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes?
Eugenics were, if not popular, widely utilized in this country even into the 50s. Are we doing any better reacting to genocides occurring all over the world still today?
That's a huge question. Pat, I keep looking over you because you have much more information on this than I do.
No.
I'll put it this way. We are working desperately on it. We're identifying things now. We have different models that we're using. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is informing the State Department. President Obama has, for the first time, has a direct desk dealing with genocide and mass atrocity that every day gets updates and reports. The first administration to do that. From my understanding, this is a kind of job where you're successful when nothing happens. And my understanding was that in Macedonia about 10 or 11 years ago, it was almost genocide. And then because of the work done by folks, it didn't go that way. It was cut. So we're making progress, but we live in a very complex world that has all these dynamics, and we just have to keep fighting and learning. One of the big impediments, of course, is state sovereignty, that a state exists, and if they start killing their own people, by international law, since the Treaty of Westphalia from way back when, those states are sovereign, you can't violate their sovereignty. So the current thinking is, how do you get around that? Well, can you say that if a state kills its own citizens, it has voluntarily surrendered its right to sovereignty? Because it's not protecting its citizens, and thus does that make the issue move? Well, we're wrestling. We're trying to find out how to proceed. Renata.
I'm still wondering and struggling also with what you said about the almost beautiful art, you know. But we have to remember also at that time there was no grass because the prisoner ate every little green. It appeared very different. And I saw very moving by Marion, his last name starts with K. His number is actually 342. He was like one of the Poles, and he survived and never told anybody he had a stroke. And then he started to paint, and then all his memory came out. And he said that actually for him the hardest thing was, he tells a story that they were chased by some Nazis who were bored, and he climbed up a pole, which was horrible, but then he saw the world beyond the camp, and he was reminded actually of the normalcy of the world beyond, but in the camp it was horrific, right? You know, so I don't know whether at that point, yes, now the buildings are beautiful, but
I so appreciate what you bring, because she always tells me along this journey that we're in. What came to mind as you said that story was when you get to the back of Birkenau, the gas chambers everywhere. You're at the back of the camp. Literally through the barbed wire, you see the rolling hills. You see freedom. And in my mind at that moment, I thought that was the last psychological trick they played. They wanted to show you freedom and that there was hope.
Exactly.
Seconds before. So that's how it played off in my mind. Yeah. Way up back, yes, sir.
I had a question, kind of bringing it to today in social media. You brought up the fact that states often will risk slipping down a morally bad path just by the perpetuation of ideas that themselves and the other. Do you think social media nowadays exacerbates that tendency, helps hasten a society down that path, or does it provide kind of those fire breaks that allow kind of a pause and a reflection and help society reassess where it's going?
So a fairly great question. I'll answer with yes. I think both dynamics are true. And I think of anything we do in the world, I think both dynamics are true. As much as we see ISIS and these other type of groups using social media this way, we see a pushback from all of our kids on social media saying, what are you talking about homophobia? What are you talking about this, that, and the other? They push back. So I think there's a great empowerment. What I want to see more of is more wisdom. There's a lot of knowledge, but very little wisdom. So I think one of our jobs as educators is to help, how do you deal with all this overwhelming information, because the knowledge is there, in more wise ways. So I think both are true. Let me see, someone who's not asked, and then I'll come back. Yes, up back.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you. I went to Auschwitz when I was about 20 or 21. I was living in Germany at the time, and it's all part of German high school curriculum.
Yep.
And I went out there, and I realized watching your presentation how much I have suppressed from that visit, just subconsciously. Because, I mean, I have some pictures, but not many. But I was recently visiting family in Berlin last fall, and in partnership with the German National Holocaust Memorial, at the German History Museum there was an exhibit about the treatment of homosexuals under the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
And what shocked me was this tiny little room in the shape of a pink triangle off the side. And it said, when the camps were liberated, if you were communist, if you were Russian, if you were gay, you were not allowed out in accordance with paragraph 175 of the German Grundgesetz, basic law. And
Constitution.
Thank you. And I was shocked by that, absolutely unbelievably shocked. Standing there thinking about it and touching on why didn't we know. I was thinking maybe we didn't know because our government didn't want us to know that we were using the very camps.
It's a very helpful bridge. It's a terrific story. I want you to revisit those photographs and tell me what you see, so make sure we get our contact information after this.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things. Homosexuals are re-interned in the camps after the war. By Allied troops, because it was not only illegal with paragraph 175, it was also illegal in the United States of America. So they were breaking U.S. law as well, and so all these are re-interned. So I'm wrestling with a couple of things here. So that was the first point I wanted to make, and now I forgot the other ones. They've escaped me. Oh my. It was very interesting that the first targets of the SS and the Germans were homosexuals. And I think, oh, that's what it was. We get to, I don't think it's that they don't want us to know. When Allied troops start, you know those World War II movies where you've got the bomber crews flying over Berlin, and then you got the guy from Brooklyn, you got the guy from Texas, you know. That's the first time that ever happened in American history, where all regions actually came together and began to inform each other. Don't forget, we had a very segregated, democratically run Southern apartheid system in our country, right? Mm-hmm. And when these soldiers arrived at the camp, see how it was done was that this is how it was a perception problem. All the propaganda I've seen about Nazi Germany during the war is that Nazi Germany embodied all that's evil in the world. So collectively, dump anything evil you want. The Holocaust, persecution of homosexuals, is another example of a collective general, that's bad, right? When the guys arrive at the camps, I can especially think of Southern troops as well, and they walk in and they realize that in these camps, these people aren't here for any other reason than they are particularly identified for homosexual or Jew. That was a shock, because now what had been a general, their evil, became very real. And many of these troops began to realize they carry the same prejudices. You know, it's no great coincidence that after the liberation, a lot of these veterans start working on civil rights. And we have now rabbis working with black civil rights, marching hand in hand with veterans. Because I think what happens, and why we Americans wrestle with this topic so much, this isn't our trauma. This didn't happen here, though we have our own histories that we're wrestling with. But I think why we have a museum in Washington, D.C., right off the mall. You have a place that celebrates all the great achievements of individuals and of government. And then you have this museum that says, and yet, individuals and governments can do awful things as well. I think in America, we say we have similar human tendencies of racism, segregation, bigotry, lynching. We continue, and we turn a path, and we say, this is our future, we reject it. And we choose a different path. So we are constantly informed by this history. So we bring up these stories, all of us collectively as Americans in our free, wonderful society wrestle with that implication as we struggle to make our republic stronger.
We take one more question, and then we go home before they kick us out. One more question.
These are wonderful questions. Thank you for staying and your questions as well.
We can answer one more question.
Well, I just wanted to add the Roma people too also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just thought it was important to mention.
Thank you. I work with a Roma she's from Sweden now. I just met her this past fall, and I would say in any definition of the Holocaust, which is really Judeo-centric, other groups are targeted as well. I would include the Roma as part of that targeting as well. And that was, I have no permission to answer any other questions, so what we'll do is, please, if you would like, and I did not include this here, but if you'd like to be on the Cohen Center's mailing list, we're just across the way, we're not too far away. We have a lot of public events, a lot of forums, workshops and things, or if you're having coffee one morning with friends and say, you know what, this question is bugging me, give me a call because I love coffee. I especially love Irish coffee later in the day. But please be in contact with us, and I hope you'll help us in our work to make this a better world. Thank you so much.
The enemy territory across the...
Yeah.
We would like to give you a gift from Vermont, which is put together from Grafton Village Cheese Company, plus Rob Family Farm, and through North Granada that they work together make this beautiful basket.
Just so everyone knows, I went to school in Vermont College, so there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Good night.
Thank you.